How about that? Hey, look at there. Not really sure exactly what happened there, or what was going on. Um, but yeah, so I apologize for the lack of volume, but for some reason, OBS decided that it was going to forget that my microphone existed, even though it's sitting like
Right here.
But as I was saying, I came in and I forgot to change the title and the information for stuff. I guess I was just very excited to be on stream. But tonight we are continuing our series on the history of government and politics. And tonight we are going to be in the third episode, and we are looking specifically at a lot of changes and a bunch of changes that are going to have really, really big impacts on how we handle things like government and politics, because we're going to, we're just going to have to deal with new stuff. And we all know that we very frequently don't do good jobs when it comes to new stuff. But let me say hello to everybody. Matt, hello and welcome. Matt has been here for a while. Matt just apparently gets so excited that I'm streaming, which is a very warm and fuzzy feeling on the heart side. Matt, good to see you. Maddie is here. Welcome in. Frank is here. Aloha, Frank. My wife is here now. Up volume. So the volume here on my controller board is all the way up, and I'm sitting fairly close to the microphone. So I can turn up the gain, but I think that's going to start causing potential additional issues. But maybe I can turn it up a wee bit. How is that, Maddie? Is that any better? That was like a touch. I don't necessarily want to spike out in the red. Silver is here. What's up? Hello, hello, hello. You enjoy? No, 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 no. I take that as a very high compliment. I was not meaning to cast any sort of aspersion or negative context to that. But I'll just say this: I've been very positively encouraged in the last few weeks by streamers and friends that are friends from stream. It's a good thing, and I'm not fishing here for compliments or feedback or anything like that. But just had a friend, you know, not too long ago, like yesterday, post that they're going to that they've gotten back into college, and part of that was because of coming to the stream and realizing that they still like learning and still have material that they want to get. So that kind of stuff makes me feel pretty good, and it really validates the decisions that I've made to keep streaming. So I appreciate everybody being here, and I say that completely honestly. So Tuna is here from Dallas. I hope the first flight was okay, and I hope that the second flight will treat you very well. But Dallas Fort Worth is a big airport that is not necessarily well laid out. So you've been low-key terrified for 3 days now. I could probably guess why, but I could say that I hope that recognizing that there are a lot of people that do not celebrate the changes that have happened, and many of those people are in the room with us. And I hope that even the recognition that there are people that feel differently than what a lot of the stuff is going on will embolden you and hearten you, reinforce the idea that you're not crazy, and we'll make it through by leaning on each other, right? We'll get along with a little help from our friends. So I hope that is the case. Time will tell. You have a history with Texas airports. Yeah, a lot of people do. Thanks, Paul. You're very welcome. All right. So yeah, let's kick this off. So we've been for the last couple of weeks looking at the history of government and politics. And specifically here, we're going all the way back to the beginning. And when you take a government class, especially if you're in the United States and you're taking one in high school, you're not going to get most of this. You're going to get, and we came up with laws, and there was this guy named Hammurabi, and that's your first lesson. And then the rest of it is pretty much going to be, here's how America found its ideas. But there were people that did government for a much longer period of time, and we've had government for as long as we've lived in groups. So I decided when I was going to do the history of government and politics that I was actually going to start at the beginning, like where it actually came back, to where we actually can start looking at elements that we can identify that are the same as us, right? A lot of the same things that we run into conflict with today are things that people have had to deal with in groups going all the way back to the beginning. And so we've been looking at a lot of stuff that's a lot older, right? Grethar.
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus.
Grethar
I'm Spartacus.
is
I'm Spartacus.
Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus.
Grethar, thank you so much for that subscription. And as always, I appreciate your support. I hope that you're having a good one, and I hope that this recent cold spate here in the States has not translated to impossible living conditions in your world. What's up, Noger? Good to see you. The only thing good about this stuff is that they're easy to spot. Sure. Yeah, so we're going back to the Bible in Greece and 14th century Italian city-states, right? So that's the only that's the only basis of government that we have, right? Before Machiavelli and Jesus, who really ever did government, right? Cave Geek is here. Good to see you. And Kyle is here. Also good to see you all. I hope you're all having good ones. So we looked at us running around in the middle of nowhere as small little groups that we called bands, and that was sort of the first discussion, coinciding with the concept of power, which is a topic that plays a lot into government and politics. So then we moved into last stream where we talked about us getting new technology and coming up with bigger ways to handle things, and this is going to lead us to our tribe and our first sort of quasi-identifiable political office of the first among equals. And tonight we are going to get into really big changes that have really, really, really big impacts. And we're going to look at specialization, surplus, and sedentary life. And all three of these things had humongous impacts on our concepts of government and politics, and they're going to today still play an oversized role in the mechanisms that make government and politics work, right? So why do we try to solve these problems the way that we do now? It's because we have surplus, we specialize, and we're living in the same spot all the time. But we're going to look at this kind of as a ideological progression, or at least as much as we can. So let's start with our first topic here, which is specialization. Now, specialization means that we have people in our groups that can do one thing very, very well, and that is most, if not all, of what they do. So their contribution to the group is this one particular skill, or maybe they spend most of their time doing this one particular skill. And in today's world, this is something that everybody pretty much does, right? We all basically specialize at our jobs. And one of the things that we have to do in today's world to handle this is you have to get training to specialize in your job. You have to have certifications to specialize in your job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And the idea is that if we only do one thing, we do that better, we do it faster, we do it more efficiently. Well, in the ancient world, prior to specialization existing, everybody pretty much had to do everything. Now, we have talked a little bit in the last couple of episodes about the growing recognition that we start seeing certain types of jobs being shifted to what we might call like gender separated jobs, where we might have the the male members of our tribe doing certain things, the female members of our tribes doing certain things. And that's a thing that happens, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they were not potentially interchangeable if the necessity arose. But at some point, we are going to start specializing. And for a very long time in anthropology, and here, when I say a long time of anthropology, we have to recognize that anthropology as a sort of an organized field is really, well, we could just say very comfortably that it's less than 250 years old, right? It's not even close to being 250 years old, but there are arguments about when anthropology started and who was the first anthropologist and da 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 da, right? Comfortably, yeah, I know. And see, Maddie is like, well, careful, right? So in the field of anthropology, there are a lot of people that want to argue about this. We're not necessarily worried about that tonight. But what we can say is that for the vast majority of the duration of anthropology being an organized field, the old progression sort of went like this. We figured out technology, and this, by the way, is sort of the old model. We might call it a model of progression between these things. So the old model kind of went like this. We figure out techniques that allow us to create a surplus of food. And when we can create a surplus of food, this allows us to settle down. And then when we settle down, our surplus continues to grow, and we have enough food that allows people to specialize. So we hit this tipping point where we make more food than we need, and that frees up labor, and that labor can then be used to specialize. That's the old model. Lost Damon. I guess it could be demon. It depends on how we're pronouncing that ether symbol right there. But welcome in. Thank you so much for the follow, and welcome to the adventure. Hope you're having a good one. Please feel free to participate at whatever level you feel comfortable. Yeah, so this is the agrarian or agricultural revolution, also called the Neolithic Revolution. We're going to talk about that extensively tonight. But what I want to talk about before we get there is a lot of evidence that seems to maybe contradict that old model. So if the old model was surplus, then settle, then specialize, right? We don't know if that's the case anymore. And there are some problems with that model that mostly come out of archaeology, which is actually a part of anthropology overall. So the concept here is that we are faced with new evidence. And the new evidence is we've dug up stuff that doesn't fit this model. And we don't really know how to handle that. Well, I should say a lot of people don't know how to handle this. This starts in places like the map here, right? We have on our map a region which is broadly considered Mesopotamia in the ancient world. And the specific locations that we're going to do a lot of work in are kind of over here in this region, the sort of southeastern part of what is modern day Turkey. And the archaeological excavation stuff coming out of southwest or southeastern Turkey has effectively tipped a lot of this over. All right, so let me catch up with chat here. I see a lot of chat happening. Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies by Jay Diamond is a good book on this topic. Demon, it's definitely a popular book. It's a book that a lot of people have read. The book itself has some really novel lines of argument, and it definitely made a really, really big splash when it hit. A lot of people were completely taken aback by this new concept of like latitudinal movement, especially from Asia and into Eurasia, then over into Europe, and how civilization spreads and how it's based on these particular mechanisms. since that book has been published, there has been a lot of counterclaim, specifically focusing on some of the things that Diamond kind of leaves out of his model. I mean, I've read the book. I've got multiple copies of the book. And it's definitely something that I feel like anybody that's interested in the topic should probably read, because it is something that very, very frequently does come up in conversation, 100%. Don Does Math is rating in. Don, are you not entertained? Don, how's it going, my friend? Welcome. I was watching you play DayZ yesterday. I've never played DayZ, so I have no idea what was going on, but you looked like you weren't dying, which is probably better than I would do. But welcome, Don, and everybody from Don's following. Welcome. If you don't know who I am, my name is Shane. I teach college, teach history and sociology and anthropology, and we're usually talking history on my channel. And we've been in a bit of a series for the last few weeks, specifically looking at the history of government and politics, which I think is kind of pertinent. A lot of people in the last year or so have asked me a lot of very specific questions about how government and politics and stuff like that works. So I figured I would spend some time answering questions. So we're kind of taking it from the beginning. But I hope everybody's doing well. So for those of you that don't know Don, Don is a mathematician that spends a lot of time doing stuff on his stream that blows my mind, in a good way, because Don is incredibly intelligent, very gifted with math, and just has the goodness in his heart to spend time helping people figure math out. So if you're interested in mathematics or learning, Don also does gaming on stream, was playing DayZ, and has played a few other games on stream. Go give Don a follow. Very chill stream. Really cool guy. And yeah, you should just totally go do that because I said so, right? You did have a decent run of not dying, but that is what I do most in that game. I'm pretty lost on how all of it runs. But right now, there was a comment by a chatter about the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, so I was giving a little bit of feedback on the book itself, and basically it's a very important book because it has a lot of ideas that were very, very catchy and had a lot of impact, especially in the popular world. It's very rare that you see an academic-based book do as well as that book did in the sort of the non-academic world. But the book itself is an interesting premise that is not completely all the way worked through. And again, it's not like a horrible book that I would tell nobody to ever read, but you should read it with the understanding that the particular model that Jared Diamond uses in the book is based on quantifying certain qualities of civilizational development higher than others and leaving other criteria out. And one of the biggest personal, like if I ever got to meet Jared Diamond, the first thing that I would bring up in his conversation, he has the book is basically an explanation, or Diamond's explanation, of why certain civilizations lasted and certain civilizations did not last, and why certain groups had a lot of success, whereas certain ones didn't, rather. One of the biggest things that I think that he leaves out, especially when he's discussing his theory on how this all spreads, and he starts talking about New World colonization, is that he really leaves out a concept of historical progression in time, and he sort of assumes that the European civilizations were on the same timeline of development as the New World civilizations, but we know for a fact that's not the case. There was civilization in, there was migration into the Old World tens of thousands of years prior to migration into the New World. And what that does is it delays the potential for those people to develop in the first place. If we're all starting at the same starting point, it's easy to say, oh, well, this group just didn't catch up because of where they are latitudinally. But we're not all starting at the same beginning point. The European culture started much earlier than the American cultures did, just by the time it took for human beings to migrate across the globe to get to the New World. So it's not necessarily fair to say that we're starting at the same time contemporaneously. And one of the things that I think it leaves out is how fast a lot of the societies in the New World actually did develop in comparison to societies in the Old World. So if you look at, let's say, the first time human beings got into the European continent, we're talking about maybe somewhere between 50 and 40,000 BC is when humans started really migrating into what we might call Northern Europe. They didn't have a high-level technological civilization in that region for another 45-ish thousand years, right? Whereas if we look at somewhere like Mexico, we look at when people first arrived in Mexico, and the oldest evidence that we could probably guess is somewhere between 20 and 25,000 years ago, probably. And that's on a model that's actually being very actively reorganized now with additional American archaeological evidence. But that's between 20 and 25,000 years after we already get people going on over in Europe. So they have a 20,000 year head start. It's not necessarily latitude, it's a massive amount of time to accumulate technology. So that's sort of the stuff that I would say is a critique that I could offer for the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's not a completely horrible book, and I don't. There are very few books that I would say you should never ever read that. But if you're going to read it, also read some of the anthropological critiques, and there are many more of them. I've just given you one angle that I would use as a critique. There are many other anthropologists that would offer a lot of different critiques and a lot of different tweaks to the model that Diamond proposes. And there are a lot of people that have published things that are readily available as a way to sort of either critique or augment the model proposed by Diamond to make it better or to discredit parts of it. So don't just read it and then a lot of the commentary about it. And I think that you'll be pretty good then. Are we targeting V. Gordon Child? Maybe a little bit. Maybe a little bit, right? The old paradigm doesn't know how to fit it into a standard model. This is true, Frank. So getting kind of back to our topic here, one of the biggest issues is that he invokes a lot of environmental determinism. That's very true as well. There's not a lot of choice in a lot of these situations. Human beings in Diamond's model don't necessarily have the ability to affect their surroundings. They're sort of captured by it, and they're either going to succeed or they're going to fail regardless of their level of intelligence or skill or their developed level of civilization, just because they're in this geographic zone. I think that's one of the bigger, more obvious critiques that could be given in there. So here comes Don. It's not written for professionals. Well, it's written to try to appeal to both sides. It definitely did not appeal to professionals or academics as much as Diamond hoped, or at least that's my belief. You like the idea about megafauna and common direction of the continent can provide how cultures... So there is a little bit of that I could get behind. Geographic interplay into migration is very, very obvious, right? Human beings are going to migrate into certain areas, and we're going to have certain pathways that we take because they're the path of least resistance. And we're also going to follow certain geographic pathways because we need the necessity. We just have to have food and water. So there are certain pathways that move across Asia and Europe and into Africa that you're going to use more frequently than others. And those areas are likely to have higher populations, and they're also then more likely to accumulate more physical culture, more levels of civilization, etc. That part I largely don't necessarily have a humongous issue with. I do think that it's some of the cases he takes uh, a little bit of what's the word here that I'm trying to look for? License, a little bit of license perhaps, to play sometimes where humans are migrating and we have ice caps, and then it matters because we have ice caps. But then some of his other arguments, specifically when it comes to like how fast sedentary life developed in certain areas, he forgets that there are ice caps and he pretends that there isn't. So there's a little bit of like trying to have it both ways in some of the arguments there. I would have to read the book again to be more specific than that. But I remember thinking at a certain point, like, which way is it? Is it ice caps were effective and affecting this particular situation, or they weren't? So, of course, during periods of the Earth's history, we've been under glaciation and stuff like that. So, your mind latched on to the idea that cities lead to animal/human diseases, and that aids in the domination of other I did not read that sentence very well. Basically, disease plays a role in this. Sure, it does, and that's definitely going to develop more frequently where you have higher concentrations of population. Latitudinal technology idea seemed weaker. Yeah, I agree. Catching up is not a thing either. Sure. Rome didn't seem to have much trouble conquering areas with winter after all. Sure. All right, Tuna, safe flight, my friend. Okay, so kind of getting back to our topic at hand, we're discussing the order of development, and I proposed what we might call traditional anthropological model, where we have developed the technology that we need to create a food surplus. The surplus has allowed us to settle down and live in a sedentary life, and that sedentary life then encourages us to increase our level of surplus. That increased surplus will then create specialization because we free up labor and people have more time to do more things. So that's the old model. But we're specifically here talking about this region on the map, especially regions like here in southeastern Turkey, where we have evidence now that seems to upend this model. Most notably at archaeological places like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, new sites that have been excavated even within the last couple of years, places like Boncuklu Tarla, which is a really small area that most people probably have never heard of, but it's a really fascinating site. But the biggest issue with these particular sites is that the skill involved in creating these works seems to indicate fairly high levels of specialization. So for those of you that are not familiar with these locations, what we're looking at here are big ceremonial T-shaped pillars that have quite a bit of carving and decoration on them that belies the idea that these people did not have any level of specialization. But what's interesting and what the sort of kicker is that they are chronologically dated way before we were supposed to be living in sedentary life. And at most of these sites, there's no evidence that anybody lived at these locations. So what we have then is a ceremonial location or a crossroads of migrating groups, and they show up and they work on these things, and it's very evident that some of these people have high levels of skill and specialize, because the carving is not something that's done in a rudimentary way. These are three-dimensional relief carvings. These are rocks that are moved in specific locations that have a lot of work put into them to make them. So this is not just necessarily a Stonehenge kind of thing here. This is a a purposefully oriented typed location with high levels of artistic skill, high levels of involvement, lots of organized effort towards one common goal. And that itself is a little bit confusing because the thought here is, at least the archaeological and anthropological thought has been in the past, that it took centralized government to motivate people to do these things, right? If I say, hey, we're going to go put up a whole bunch of rocks in a big circle and we're going to spend a long, long time carving them to make them look really nice, that most people are going to say, no, that's not an efficient use of my calories, and they're not going to participate. So it would take a government to force something like this to happen. But that doesn't seem to be the case with places like Göbekli Tepe. Romans didn't ask themselves if they were able to survive in the northern Europe because it was populated for a long time. Sure, it's more interesting how first human tribes got there considering the cold climate. And part of that is the more interesting parts of the book, Lost Demon. I agree. And that's how we got Neolithic neoliberalism, not to be confused with Paleolithic paleoliberalism. Right. This is like your Archaeology 212 class where the professors went on and on and on about the development of high-level irrigation that was found to have been created before the rise of highly stratified people. Yes, so we're about to talk about irrigation here in a bit, Maddie. Or am I describing 4K BCE? So Göbekli Tepe is 10,000 years old. It's between, so it's estimated between 12,000 and 10,000 years old. So like 10,000 BC-ish. It's really, really old. It's way before we have any other evidence of people living in sedentary life. We don't really know what's going on here. And there is some evidence that Karahan Tepe, which is another site that's not too far away, is actually potentially older than that stuff. So we don't know. But what does that do to our model? If the entire model is supposed to be make a surplus, then settle down, then specialize, well, what does that do to the model when we have clear specialization prior to surplus? Now we have to freak out, right? I like that. This is not an efficient use of my calories excuse for getting out of work. You can absolutely use that, Silver. I only have a certain number of calories to spend, and this is not an efficient use of my calories. What's up, Rexler? Good to see you. Welcome in. So what's the new model? Well, now we have arguing. So if specialization comes first, do we have specialization, then we settle down, then we create a surplus? Or do we have specialization first, then we create a surplus, then we settle down? And the answer is we don't really know. Now, let me be clear. There are a lot of people in archaeology and a lot of people in anthropology that heard about places like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and they just rolled with it. They were like, yep, time to revise the models. And now a lot of those people are convinced. I don't think we know enough to be convinced. And I think that's actually okay, right? If you've been around the stream long enough, you'll know that I think it's okay to say we don't know. And we're talking about stuff so far back in history with so few sites and such limited data. I don't know if we will ever know. We may, but we also may not. And one of the things that I don't think a lot of people consider is that we have a tendency, right? And this is modern day humans and most what we might call modern humans going back to, maybe the Enlightenment. We have this tendency to sort of think that civilization moves in a straight line, right? It's always in a trending upward path. And we forget how fragile the ancient world was. And it's possible, and I think that this is actually something that is kind of catching on in some levels of academia, but not a lot of them. I think what it's okay to suggest is that we may have had movements where we made some progressions, and then the population that made those progressions faced some sort of catastrophe, and then we lost those progressions, and people in another part of the world had to pick them up independently of the first group and make their own progressions. So it's not one mass of humanity all working in one direction towards the same goal. It's my tribe over here and your tribe on a different continent and your tribe that's on the other side of the mountain range, and we're all trying to survive. So we have these moments where some people groups make progression and then that progress is lost, and other groups make progression and that progress might get partially lost, or maybe 2 or 3 of those people will peel off of that tribe and go to another tribe and remember that it's possible, so they try to recreate it, but then the original tribe that has this level of technology or progress dies. And I think that's what a lot of people have kind of woken up to. I don't know if I should say a lot of people. I think some people, myself included. This idea that we progress not uniformly. We have regressions, right? We have points of time where our levels of politics and government will rescind and will move backwards technologically, that kind of stuff, right? Does it have to be one universal model? Why can't one group of people? Yeah, and see, Don's already here because Don's thinking mathematically, right? Where we don't have to have one unifying variable. We can have multiple variables that move independent of each other. And I think that's the beauty of adding a lot of the science that we've added to history and anthropology and archaeology, because it's given us different angles to look at. Prior to, I would even say maybe 15, 20 years ago, the grand theory model dominated humanities and social sciences. You had to have one theory that explained everything. And we can look at many of these progressing theories, right? We had positivism in the Enlightenment that was going to explain everything using factual data. Then we have classicism. Then we have postmodernism, or we have these tons of different groups of people, and we try to cram everything into one thing. Freud comes out with psychoanalytic theory, and then we have to describe all of human history through psychoanalysis, right? We like this one-size-fits-all approach because it's easy. It allows us to learn one thing and then apply that to everything. But humans aren't easy like that. We're not just one-size-fits-all creatures. We are messy and we are disparate, and we have lots of different ways to try to accomplish the same things. But what that means is one theory might not fit everything. If you have an expert weaver or a tool maker, they might specialize before the rest of the tribe specializes. And that's true as well, Frank, right? It's not the straight line. We have multiple degradation examples. Yeah, exactly. So we have a lot of examples of how we could have gone backwards, and we have examples of how we did go backwards. So us trying to necessarily pick one of these models and say this is the way that it happened is not necessarily something that I think we can ever prove. We might be able to argue with specificity. We might be able to say something like, in this area, this is the progression of stuff. We might be able to determine right now what my dog is barking at. But also, we may never know because she's getting old and she's a little bit senile. And she might literally just be barking at the dark. Who knows? But we're not sure exactly how it proceeds. But it is at least clear that specialization can happen prior to surplus and prior to sedentary life, because we have examples of both of these. But what that does is it throws our understanding of a lot of this stuff into confusion. And that's okay as well, because admitting that we need to re-examine our analysis is a positive thing, right? The way that the scientific method works is when you get more data, you have to go back and reanalyze the theory. And if the theory needs to be reevaluated, it needs to be reevaluated. If it needs to be changed, it needs to be changed. That's the way that it works, right? So it's okay to get new information. But again, and I don't know if this is necessarily the case with other people that might be in the room that have done academics, but I can promise you that it's this way in history, and I can double promise you that it's this way in sociology. A lot of people don't like giving up old, powerful ideas. This is why in sociology we've had basically three big paradigms of thought in the last 250 years of sociology. And every time a new idea comes up in sociology, it gets chewed up and spat out because the only thing that the big three groups can agree on is that there should only be three groups. Right? We don't need a new paradigm. We don't need a new way of looking at stuff. We just need to circle the wagons around conflict theory and symbolic interactionism and structural functionalism, and that's the only way to view the world, right? Science advances one death at a time. Wow, Frank, it's kind of a powerful but unfortunately true statement. Tad also barks at the dark. Tad, you came in earlier, and I read your message, but I did not say hello to you. Hey, Tad, how's it going? And Femavox came in, and I did not say hello to Femavox, but hello as well. All right. So, this is specialization. We get it, right? But what does this do towards government and politics? Well, we're going to circle back to that. Let's talk about the other two concepts briefly. But specialization is going to give us basically what we have today that we understand as government and politics. Geeks Tour says, change is harder for some than others. This is 100% true. 100% true. Welcome in, Geeks. Good to see you. A lot of people make certain ideas the basis of their identity. And then if those ideas are challenged, they feel as if they are challenged as a person, and then they react rather protectively, including ignoring things that might be completely valid or ignoring obvious data points or refusing to participate in conversations. So it's an unfortunate reality that we as humans attach so much of ourselves to what we believe. But it's also one of the greatest benefits of being a human. So it's one of these things where it is our weakness and strength at the same time. We just have to be aware of how we're using it. And a lot of people just aren't. And that's, hopefully why we're learning, right? We learn to be more aware. We make better decisions. It's easier for us to change our mind when presented with new data. These are good things, right? All right. So let's talk a little bit about surplus. Why is this such a big deal, and how did we even come up with it? Well, at a certain period of time, and this is a little bit different in a little bit of a different area. So normally if you hear the words Neolithic Revolution, you're going to hear that in reference to the Neolithic Revolution that happened basically on the screen here, right? That is a little bit on purpose because it's kind of the way that Western history teaches things. We find the point where it happened, that it affects us, and say this is the place that it happened and this is the only place that it happened. But every civilization that has risen past tribal groups and into sedentary life has had a Neolithic revolution. So there are hundreds of these or thousands of these across time. And basically this is when people figure out agriculture, right? When we find that magic ability to turn horticulture, which is sort of tending a little bit of a garden and maybe keeping up with some native plant life in the area by protecting it, to we can now farm and make reliable amounts of food. And that's a big, big deal. I think this is a sidetrack, so please ignore it. But instead of blaming individual followers for letting their ideology keep them from changing their beliefs, maybe the leaders are to blame for cementing the ideas to the group identity as shibboleths. So basically as unassailable truths. Frank, it goes both ways. So we can apply the Uncle Ben rule here, that with great power comes great responsibility. And if I recognize that I'm the head of a group, I should act with the the decency and the mercy and the comportment that I would to be a good leader. And I must recognize that my actions are going to have ramifications on the beliefs and actions of others. And as a recognition of such, I should be very careful and thoughtful about everything that I say, everything that I declare to be the truth, and everything that I say has to be followed. Now, on the other hand, it is the role of the person within the group that's not the leader to exercise discretion on their own part, to apply healthy skepticism, to go, this person is in a position of authority in my world, yet they are a human just like I am. They have a bias just like I do. They're fallible just as I am. So to what extent do I give this sort of unassailable truth credence to what they say? And at that point, a person should apply logic and rationale and look for objective truth and then make the wisest decision. So it's a reciprocal back and forth sort of thing. And it's not necessarily as much of a sidetrack as you might think, because one of the things that's about to start happening, this is a little bit of ahead, but we can catch back up here in just a second. One of the things that starts happening when we create a surplus of food is us having to decide what we do with our free time. And one of the first answers is the first person that gets to slack off of food production is going to be in a position of power over us, right? So how do we follow this person wisely? How does that person wisely make decisions, right? What a magical moment. The Neolithic Revolution is a magical moment because we figure out food. And food is important. Dame Karen, welcome in. Good to see you. It's been a little while. The Uncle Ben rule. Yeah, it's a good rule, right? It's a good rule. Chris, welcome in. Good to see you. It's too bad they didn't invest some of that free time in dental and healthcare. You know, it's true, but how much less would we know about the ancient world if those people took care of their teeth? Well, okay, so it's a bit of a 6 1 half dozen another. If they took care of their teeth better, we'd have more DNA. But if they didn't take care of their teeth the way that we did, we wouldn't know so many of their practices. So it's like, we're going to get a little bit of data this way, but we could get different kinds of data that way. And then we have to argue about which one is the more important set of data. So it's an interesting angle of things, and this is a bit of a conundrum that you could argue here, and Maddie's picking at my brain in a fun and delightful trolley kind of way. Imagine dying of dental care. That would have been nasty. Yeah, you know, in the ancient world, you can get like if you need a root canal in the ancient world, you don't have root canal technology. So if you end up with, some sort of big cyst or some kind of, I can't say the word, there's a word for the abscess, that can turn into sepsis and you die from it. Yeah. That's unfortunate, but it's the case. Is the answer C? Geeks, yes, that is the correct answer. If we had the best of both worlds, it would always be better if we had the best of both worlds. So this agricultural moment, this agricultural revolution, this agrarian revolution, this Neolithic revolution is so important to ourselves as a species, because this is the sort of, like, it's one of the big turning points, right? There are a few revolutionary moments in the history of our species that are effectively unparalleled, except amongst them, this little group, right? Like when we figured out how to harness fire prior to us even being Homo sapiens, that's a huge deal. When we figure out how to make more food than we need, holy crap, that's a huge deal, right? But how do we do that? Well, this is a little bit of a carryover from last time, but this is sort of how I planned on talking about all of this stuff. We came up with new technology, right? So last stream, when we were talking about our tribal groups growing in size because we're producing more food, we were doing that through supplementing our hunter-gatherer stuff with horticulture. And this might be through slash and burn. This might be through small patches of garden plots that we farm extensively. But how do we go from that to clearing a big field specifically for the use of long-term farming? How do we figure out stuff like how to fertilize a crop? How do we figure out how to irrigate those crops? All of this is new technology. But this actually plays a little bit into the discussion that we were just having. Some people are just going to do more farming in our tribal groups than others. And some people are going to get really good at it, and some people are going to perhaps even specialize in farming prior to us living in sedentary society. But they're going to be the people that are just really good at what they're doing. And again, this isn't a light switch kind of thing. It's not like we have one group of people and today they're hunter-gatherers and then tomorrow they're completely sedentary. We actually see multiple sites archaeologically where we can find these sort of transitionary locations. One of them is again in Turkey. There's this place called Çatal Hoyuk, a place that I've been. It's basically an attempt at making the first city, but it's not a city. The population wasn't stable. The people didn't live there even year-round some of the times, but at a certain point, there was a permanent population there, and it was very small, but these people were pretty obviously living in this place year-round, while the vast majority of people in their area were still doing hunter-gatherer stuff. So we also have places like the ancient site of Jericho, which is in Israel. You find this giant, very ancient wall, and you have a big camp inside. And how many people lived inside the wall is a question mark because the population fluctuated quite rapidly through the year and even through periods of time where there was no one living there at all. But then we see a small population that does tend to be permanent while the majority of the other people around are moving and doing hunter-gatherer kind of stuff, right? So it's not like everybody was hunter-gatherer and then we all stopped doing that and settled down. It's a spectrum of shift. If those fruits were seeded and have a selection bias, making them larger and more calorific, might that help? Absolutely, Frank. But we recognize this stuff, right? We are picking up on these trends and this awareness and level of intellectual technology that we're developing is getting passed down, and we are figuring out how to affect the world around us more readily. All right. We've done herding quite a while. When do we get goats? Goats are one of the first animals that are domesticated. They're not as far back as dogs. Dogs are like 15-ish thousand years ago. Goats, I think, are between 8 and 9,000. So it's pretty far back, but not like as far back as a dog. Small groups of people separated from each other, learning and developing a bunch of different skills from observation and experimenting, a small calamity. Right, and see, that's the thing, Chris. It's not all uniform. We get this sort of patchwork, right? We get some movement here, some movement there across the board. I love the idea of hunter-gathery stuff as an activity. Hey, honey, what do you want to go do this weekend? Oh, I don't know, some hunter-gathery stuff. Yeah, pretty much, right? Why have goats when you can have kangaroos? Kangaroos are a lot harder to domesticate, as noted that they are not domesticated today. They are ornery creatures that will kick you, right? But we develop new tools, right? And these groups of people that are the ones that make it happen are figuring out the techniques that are going to spread. And these are things like new actual physical tools, right? We're going to make new stone tools that are designed to help us farm. We're going to create rakes and hoes, and we're going to create plows and things like this. Now, this isn't like a plow as you're thinking about it that's pulled behind a domesticated pack animal. These are things that are basically like really big adzes, which is kind of like a long extended hoe that's designed basically at breaking up large chunks of ground. We're also going to start domesticating new crops. This is, of course, something that takes a long time over multiple generations. And we're going to come up with new techniques for preparing our field. We figured out that slash and burn works, but obviously you can't keep doing that forever, so we had to figure out new ways of doing it. And we figure out how to do things like flood fields. But to do that from the river, we have to, that's right, we have to figure out irrigation. And irrigation is a huge part of this. And as Maddie prefaced earlier, we could probably spend an entire 2 hours talking about how we figured out how to do irrigation. But irrigation comes before we live in cities. We're still figuring out how to do this when we're wandering around in the woods to a certain extent. Now, we might have some sedentary population, but not all of our population is settled down. So when we hit this Neolithic revolution, regardless of where we are geographically, we're going to create a surplus. Right? What's up, Rod? Good to see you. And this concept of surplus is so massively important. It is basically the foundation of our modern concept of economics. It is the basis of how we figure out how to survive in a world where everybody doesn't have to work in the fields. And in many ways, it is a trap that we fell into that we have never been able to extricate ourselves from. And you go like, oh, but McInnes, look, the world that we live in today is so much cooler than it was back then. Yeah, it is. But our diets for the vast majority of civilized history have not been as varied or as good for us as when we were hunter-gatherers. Our populations have seen a lot of hardship that has come from this surplus, because if I don't have to work for my food, what if I could take other people's food from them? This is the basis of war, right? This is where we develop concepts that differentiate us from them, and we start getting ethnocentrism. If I can figure out a way to make people that don't want to work, and I can, extract their labor from them for free to create a bigger surplus, I'm going to do that. This is where we get slavery from. So it's not like surplus was the magic bullet that sold everything into paradise. Surplus carries with it a lot of its own problems. Because again, if we have more than we need, we can spend time thinking about other stuff than just surviving. And that has been the benefit of civilization, right? But that has also been, in many cases, the bane of civilization. Humans are freaking cool, just like figuring out irrigation while walking around in the forest. So Rexler, the way that this happened was, again, kind of hodgepodge over time. But we can see now, because the world of archaeology has become so much more detailed and so much more advanced in the last 15 years that it blows my mind how much stuff that we can do. But especially with things like ground penetrating radar and LiDAR and satellite imagery and stuff like that, we have discovered a lot more irrigation than we ever thought existed. And a lot of it pretty clearly just looks like people walking down the side of a river and going, you know what, if the river flooded on the other side of this hill, it would make more cool stuff to eat next time we come by. So why don't we camp here for a few days and we'll all just go dig out a pathway that allows the water to flow over to that side, and we're going to go keep walking in our year. But the next time we come back around, hey, look, it flooded over there, and look how much more food there is. That's the beginning of irrigation. Those same people, maybe 1,000 years later, were the ones that figure out that we could build canal structures and line the bottom of it with clay so that the water doesn't seep in, and we could move this miles across the surface of the ocean. And this is what, or not the ocean, the land. But this is the same technology that brings us to our modern water pipes, right? This is the beginning of moving water. This is fascinating technology because we figured it out with just some people like wandering around, right? The chimp comes out. It does. Theo, good to see you. What's up? Welcome in. The good old othering. Yeah, that's really only something that we can completely come up with in our modern concept after we have a surplus. Raiders defending their prey developed into being paid protection, becoming lord. Yeah, exactly, Chris. This is the domino that falls over that makes all of the other dominoes fall. You've been listening to a lot of Fall of Civilizations, and it's so interesting to see what happens when surpluses fail. Right, yeah. We're always about 3 days from the end of civilization. People don't eat food for about 3 days. And civilization kind of goes out the window. Right? After 3 days of no food, people don't care about society anymore. And it's, it's just like... You start getting hungry and you're going to do crazy stuff. But it's because that surplus that we have that we keep these tendencies and these urges down, right? So, new possibilities come with surplus, right? We can stay in one place. This by itself is revolutionary. And it's revolutionary for government and politics. If we go back to how we are solving problems, right? If we are in a tribe, or even before that, if we're in a band, just a band again is a very small group, maybe 15, 20 people. A tribe is a larger group that's maybe 150, 200 people. If we're moving fairly frequently and we have a problem with a group of people, or if a group of people have a problem with us, we just split up, right? And our groups change. They merge. They adapt. Our groups will fission and fusion, very, very quickly. And this was a social relief valve. If I knew that we were going to cross paths with that other group and I was just so sick of Jimmy that I couldn't take him anymore, I could go with the other group. And at that point, I could solve political and governmental problems, because deviance and crime can exist even if we don't have formal written laws. And if I'm trying to determine how we use our power, we can just take our power somewhere else when we're moving around. But when we settle down, now we have to come up with new ways to handle this stuff, right? Because if my ability to eat is predicated on me staying in this one location for another 6 months while my crops grow, I can't just up and leave. So now I have to have new mechanisms. This is going to be cultural and social technology that I have to develop to figure out how to handle this stuff, right? If I can't just up and leave Jimmy because I've got corn growing in the field, how do I deal with Jimmy? This is directly related to our concept of government and politics, right? The British Empire proves that civilization carries on even with people dying in the streets. Well, that's true, Maddie. The issue particularly there, though, that's a little bit different than the scenario that we're talking about, is that the empire itself was big enough and had so much of a surplus in the core that it didn't really care about the people on the fringes. And the surplus that existed was feeding the masses, was feeding the leadership, even if the masses were starving. And another thing that happens, and this is a little bit later on, but we'll catch back up to it here, is that when we settle down, there's going to be further advances in technology, and we have to start being careful about the monopolization of information and the monopolization of technology. Because when we develop a surplus and we settle down, we're going to have to figure out the hard way that not everybody needs every type of technology. And this is a hard thing to learn, and governments and politics are going to start limiting information in government pretty quickly upon the creation of organized and centralized groups, right? Yeah, you just send the criminals to the other side of the world, right? You send them to Georgia or you send them to Australia, right? That's what we do, right? Maddie, Jimmy is my go-to person when I need a reference to somebody doing something in the group. And in the, I guess in the larger scheme of things, I actually have a definition for who a Jimmy is. A Jimmy is a person who does something that is outside of the norm. And even if the thing that the Jimmy does is outside of the norm, it ends up producing something positive for society, right? So this can be a good thing, like Jimmy decides to come up with a new way to solve a problem that's a novel piece of technology and it benefits us, but he was stupid for doing it. But this is also the person that's like, I wonder if we can eat those berries, and he eats a stomach full of them and dies. That person's still Jimmy because he took a risk. And societies are going to need risk takers to a certain extent. Otherwise, we would never progress, because the tendency for humans is to do the thing that is safe, that is known, and that is going to produce reliable results, right? But that doesn't progress things. That causes stagnation, especially both ideologically and technologically. And corn here, I'm using corn in the 17th century British meaning, which is any crop that grows that I'm going to eat. Obviously, they didn't have corn in the ancient world. They would have had wheat or barley or something, sorghum, something like that. Considering the first crop cultures were too poor, very small. How did they manage to feed themselves from the fields? So that's a great question, Damon. The answer is that we were working on crop domestication prior to us living in sedentary life. We were domesticating crops probably 3,000 to 4,000 years prior to us settling down. So a lot of the human effect through selective breeding and things like that we were going to do to increase those yields happened prior to us settling down. And us increasing those yields is actually going to be one of the key parts of the Neolithic Revolution that allow us to produce the food that we need to settle down in the first place, right? So this is how we can probably suggest that we had a surplus before we settled down, but not everybody is going to agree with me when I say that. I have my opinions. Not everybody agrees, and that's okay. I'm joking that Jimmy the corn grower would not have been named Jimmy. Maybe he was. So maybe Jimmy was the first person that said, I'm just going to stay here. All right, I'm going to build myself a hut, and I'm going to build it out of stone instead out of sticks. And you all just leave a whole bunch of food here. And when you go, I'm going to forage by myself, but I'm going to build a field out here in my time, and I'm going to grow crops. And when you come back around this place next year, just come back here. And if I'm here, I'm going to have a whole bunch of food ready for you. That is absolutely a Jimmy corn grower, right? It was kind of a hybrid permanent culture. Yeah. So there's definitely an overlap and a transition period there for sure. So, we can grow more food than we need. We can stay in one place forever. And imminent death from starvation is not as imminent anymore. Right? Imminent death from starvation is not as imminent anymore. Imagine how much of a weight off of a society that was. Right? Imagine if every day of my life I had been worried about waking up in the morning, finding enough food to survive to the end of the day. Imagine what happens when I know that when I wake up in the morning I'm going to have enough food. And not just for tomorrow, but for the day after and the day after and the day after. What does that do to us intellectually? What does that do to us as a social unit? Well, it's going to have good things and it's going to have bad things. On the good side, this is going to allow us free time, and it's going to allow us time to imagine. Right? And our imagination had always been there. It's what drives technology. It's what drives innovation. But imagine having time now to think about something other than just basic survival. How much more is that going to affect us in a positive way? Now, this also allows us to use imagination in the wrong way. Because if we're not all collectively pulling in the same direction to survive, I can now worry about stuff. Because I'm going to worry, right? I'm not worried about necessarily feeding myself, or as Maddie says, feeding my family, which is another big worry. I'm now worried about whether or not Jimmy is stealing crops. And I'm worried about whether or not the guy that's making the baskets is going to make enough baskets in time. And I'm going to turn my imagination towards my fellows. And this is going to create social chaos because we were used to walking around. We were used to wandering. We were used to being able to just fission off and go where we wanted to. But now we have to live around these same people, and we have to think about new things, and we get the ability to think about great things, but we also have the time now to be bored and think about dumb things. And we do. Jimmy was supposed to be the basket maker, right? Right. And some pastoralism, absolutely. Jimmy sounds like your kind of dude. Maybe so. How many calories did we burn wandering nomadically? Frank, I don't know if I could give you a number. We would be moving substantial amounts every day. We would not necessarily be moving camp every day, but we would be moving a lot. We would be much more active across the day than we are today. We talked about this a little bit in the last stream. They probably did just as much work as we do, but it wasn't necessarily all in blocks, right? It's like if I go to work, I work from 7:30 to 3 o'clock, and then I come home and I have all this leisure time. That's not necessarily the way that their work happened. It might be 45 minutes here, and then I get a little bit of a rest, and then I go do an hour and a half, and I get a little bit of a rest, and I go do 2 hours to walk to the hunting grounds, and I get a little bit of a rest while I'm waiting on something. But then I've got to carry a deer back for 2 hours to get back to the group. So, it's kind of a more disparate, patchy sort of kind of thing. But it was still overall more active than the average person is today. Oh yeah, for sure. And the average hunter-gatherer would have had skills and technology that were made prior to Homo sapiens even being Homo sapiens. And we were learning from other hominids around us. We were learning from Neanderthals. We were learning from Denisovans. We're learning from Heidelbergensis. We're picking up these skills that we see other creatures and other species like us doing. So it's not like we're developing in a bubble either. But how am I going to carry that stuff long distance in those baskets, right? We have to learn to get along without driving each other crazy. That's the thing, Chris. We have to figure out how to get along, and that's this. Isn't that just what government and politics is? Us trying to figure out how to get along with each other. But that was a direct response to the surplus, right? If we didn't have the surplus, we wouldn't have to worry about that as much. If we just got mad at somebody, we could kick them out of the group and they would wander off and potentially die, right? Now we've got to live by them because I can't do my farming if that person doesn't do their fishing. And this creates a level of interdependence within a community that is in many ways a more desperate interconnectedness than a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Because if I'm doing hunter-gatherer stuff, I at least likely have the capacity to do any job necessary. But if I specialize and settle down, I now don't have the skills that I need to survive on my own. And this makes me dependent on other people. I was always dependent on them in one way, but this has shifted it, and now I am much less capable of surviving without their help. I have a surplus, and I don't have to worry about that, but now I have to worry about new things. Why can't they use imagination during monotone work like gatherings? It's literally impossible to not think about something else during the boring things. Yeah, sure, exactly. But the boring time is a real thing here, right? When we were constantly wandering around and constantly doing hunter-gatherer stuff, there was boring time, sure. But there was always something to do. There's not as much stuff to do now. I'm not doing everything. I'm doing one thing. And I get bored doing one thing, right? You guess I meant really shallow thought, like if not being nomads saved everyone 300 extra calories a day, the surplus might have been even more sudden. No. I get what you're saying, Frank. Like, what was the threshold needed to provide caloric benefit? And it's actually not wrong to try to count numbers, Frank. There have been a lot of studies, especially in biological anthropology. There have been a ton of studies that have tried to look at exactly how much we needed and exactly how much we were eating. And archaeobotany has gotten involved with this, trying to do things like sift out exactly what kinds of grains we were eating, and then looking at how big the individual grains of this emmer wheat were. And then speculating if the grains were this big, how many calories were there? And if this is on, if we find a stalk of this grain and it has this number of seeds on it, how many of these heads of grain would I have to eat to keep myself going? But then that's going to be an important and a very essential piece of data for us to know, because then we can extrapolate that out. How much crop surface of the ground do I have to grow this plant, right? And then I multiply that by the number of plants that I need to create a surplus amount of food. But then that's how much land I have to clear. But then we can make these models where we can look fairly specifically at things like, if I clear this much land, here's exactly how many people I could support if we have this level of specialization. So it might seem silly to kind of put it like, oh, well, we were only 300 calories away from being sedentary. You are not the only person that's had that thought. There are a lot of people that get just that granular in trying to count calories when it comes to figuring out how and when and why we made changes between hunter-gatherer or sedentary life. So don't feel bad about asking questions like that. You're not outside of friends there. Except the people trying to kick you out might be relatives. That's true. You always put government as a descendant of raiders who became paid protectors of those that they raided, and politics is the skill of getting along. So government is figuring out what we do with our power. We have power as an individual, and we have power as a collective. And in many cases, our collective power is greater than the sum of the parts, right? Because we add social power to physical labor, we add intellectual power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you can do something to affect the world around you, that's an element of power. And government is us deciding collectively how we're going to use that power. Politics is the science of trying to convince people to use the power in the way that you want them to, right? So we can have government without politics, but we can't have politics without government. It just doesn't. Well, let me think about that now that I say it. Well, I guess if we boil government down to its most rudimentary form of making a decision that affects other people in a group, I would hold to that. I said that, then I had to sort of pump the brakes and back up. If you daydream while wandering around, you get eaten. That's true. That's true. You have a Schofield and Smith's World History Timeline poster. Do you know how accurate it is? Ra, I do not. But if you have a picture of it, you could upload it to the Discord, and I'd be happy to look at it. If I had to make a gut assessment, most of these big timeline things are what I would call mostly accurate. And when I say mostly accurate, I mean they're going to be decent places to start, but you should not end with them, right? You're going to say, this is where things kind of happened, and you're going to get most of that information, but then you're going to need to dig in a little bit more because it's probably not exactly correct. There are probably ways where you could shift that little timeline one way or the other, or move that little line one way or the other. So mostly correct, probably, but depending, right? First day under bombing is totally terrible. On the 100th day, you'll ignore it and proceed like an everyday routine. Yeah, sure. You think being eaten, a fear of being eaten is the same thing. Maybe. I get where you're coming from, right? Like we as humans can get used to just about anything because we can cope and develop tactics to ignore stuff. Maybe. I don't know though. I'd have to give that a lot more thoughts. What's up, Flask? Welcome in. You'll take a picture of it during daylight. Okay, cool. So, we specialize. We make a surplus. We settle down. And we create chiefdoms. So if you're keeping up with organizational levels of government, first we had band. This is the smallest one that we talked about in episode 1. Then we had tribe, right? V. Gordon, child detective. Yeah, exactly, Maddie. We're going to have to get there, right? It's kind of the way that we explain things in anthropology, right? You move up to a tribe, right? And this is a larger group that moves around. But when we settle down, we make a chiefdom. And chiefdoms have quite a bit of differentiating features that are going to make it significantly different than a band and different than a tribe. Let's look at some of these defining features. First off, our population is going to be a lot bigger, right? Our population of a band is maybe like a couple dozen, maybe 30 people at a max. Our tribes, again, 100 people, 150, maybe 200 people. A chiefdom can be thousands of people. And you go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Why did we go from like this many to like this many to like this many? Surplus. When you have more food than you need, you can have bigger populations. And when you're adding people to a technological system that can produce a surplus, adding one person is not necessarily just adding one person's worth of food, right? Adding one more farmer might mean you can add 5 people's worth of food, right? Because one person here is making more food than that one person's capacity. That's what's allowing this situation to happen in the first place, right? But it can be big and it blows up. This is your second child conversation of the week in a Twitch stream. Maddie, where'd you have the other one? Just interesting. I'm not saying like, oh, no. Just, I want to know if I need to go hang out in another Twitch stream to talk cool anthropology stuff. So, bigger populations. And as we know, with bigger populations comes more problems. Right? This is like, it's the pizza issue, right? I talked about this in my anthropology class. It's the pizza issue. If I give you money and say, you go buy pizza for you, you're going to go get the exact pizza that you want. Right? If I tell you, you go buy pizza for you and me, you might not be able to get exactly what you want anymore, right? But you might be able to talk me into agreeing with you. We're probably, though, going to come to some sort of compromise where you might get half of a pizza that's yours and then I get half of a pizza that's mine, right? When you multiply that by 1,000, if I gave you money and said, go buy pizza for 1,000 people, you're going to get pepperoni and cheese, and that's going to be it. But I don't like pepperoni and cheese. Shut up, you're getting pizza. It's a pizza party, right? This is what happens with our problem solving. When we have sedentary populations of thousands of people, you can't please everybody, and it becomes really difficult to make everything work together. So we're going to need a way to settle this, and we're going to come back to that in just a second. Now, when we see specialization, and we see sedentary life, and we see surplus, these three things are going to give us another thing, and that is going to give us social classes. And I know that a lot of people have a lot of guff about social classes, and I think that we all know how big of an impact socioeconomic status has on people's lives. If you don't, hang around and talk with me a little bit. I can tell you that in the field of sociology, one of the most common determinant factors of a person's situation is going to be socioeconomic, right? That comes from the fact that when we have a surplus, that surplus is not going to be extended equally. Certain people are going to have it, other people aren't going to have it. And when we are able to specialize and we can create items of beauty, not items of utility, then we're going to have luxury items. And luxury items are going to get consolidated amongst the powerful, the people that are able to produce more, the people that are going to have more highly desirable skills. And we're going to start seeing class structures develop almost immediately. Almost immediately. Art, exactly. His name is Barudai. You should check him out. He's covering Freud right now. Let me go search that real quick here. Is this Maddie? Is he or she? Or I guess you said he. Is he like a professor or a teacher, or just a person who likes things? Reader of philosophy, PhD candidate, player of games. Dissertation. Okay, cool. I'll have to drop a follow. Interesting stuff. Maybe if he's still streaming when we finish, we'll raid over. All right. Before you specialize, having half of the physical combat power is having half of the people on your side. After specialization, you only need those whose specializations make them better at combat. You can have the tyranny of the minority. Frank, that is exactly correct. Because when we start creating luxury classes and we start creating social classes, power is the first thing that we focus on, right? And this concept of power is what gives us chiefdoms, because the centralization of power is going to give us our first full-time political position. So last stream, when we were in a tribe, we had our first among equals status, right? Right? We had our first among equal status. And, oh yeah, so we're still before cities, right? We are before cities. We are still living in villages, but we're living in sedentary villages. We're not living in cities yet. We're living in sedentary villages. And we're going to start seeing changes in those as well, but it's mostly because of proximity to the chief. So, when I can specialize, the first thing that we're going to get is a specialization in power. Now, here's a fascinating question. And this is a deep question that a lot of people want to argue about, and anthropologists like to argue about, and sociologists like to argue about, and historians like to argue about. If we're going to have a specialization of power, and this person is going to be a specialist in the use of power, what power are they exercising? Because there are different types of power. If we're looking at a first among equals situation, a lot of what they're exercising is social power, their ability to charismatically talk to people and get them to form consensuses. There is some economic power if that person is just really, really good at what they're doing and they are the best hunter or they have the best farming techniques and they can use their position to bribe others or pay off others or give loans to others, right? So you can build consensus through that kind of power. But the two leading ones that we're going to argue about a lot, political and religious. And the big question is, which one came first? If we're going to get one person, so let's say we live in a village and we produce enough surplus for one person to specialize. Is that person going to be a religious specialist and exercise religious power? Or are we going to have a political specialist who's going to specialize in political power? And we don't really know. Now, there are some people that say it's got to be politics first, right? There are some people that say, no, it's got to be religion first, right? And there's actually, in anthropology, there's this theory called the moralizing God hypothesis, right? Where we specialized in religion and these religious ideologies gave us this concept that our deities are moral and they enforce rules on us and we should follow the rules. And then when we make the rules, this is what makes society happen because we stop going against our primal urges, right? When we develop the idea that we are answerable to a power over us on a spiritual level, we have to temper the way that we act. And again, this is called the moralizing God hypothesis. But there are others now that are making a very strong argument for, well, no, it's the politics that comes first. And then the politics are what prove that power can be centralized. And then the thing that comes running right behind that is religion as a way to justify the power. So why do you get to be in charge? Well, because the God said so. Well, who says that the God said that you're the one in charge? Oh, the priest over there. Like, what's a priest? Oh, this is a new job that I just made up because I'm the chief. Right? So you see how this works? Whatever the model is, whichever one came first, what we can say, and this is a truitude or a truth that we can apply, a platitude that we can apply to all of the situations, is that religion and politics are always going to overlap. And it matters which one came first, but ultimately it doesn't have to be one or the other. We just know that these are the first two ways that we try to centralize power, and that they're going to be, in many cases, especially in the early world, the same thing. Right? A lot of these early chiefs are considered to be religious figures. In some cases, they're the same person. They're the head of the religion and they're the head of the political system, right? But this is still a specialization of power because I have a monopoly on making decisions that affect other people, right? They don't have to be mutually exclusive, Kyle. That is a correct assertion. They kick all the tanneries out, yeah, because they smell really bad, right? Some will choose others. Some will choose some. Others will choose others. This is true. Does Göbekli Tepe play any role here? Flask, before you came in, we actually had about a 20-minute discussion about how sites like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, etc. Played havoc with our understanding of early development of stuff like specialization, surplus, and sedentary life. Yeah, so we've covered all that already, but suffice to say, very briefly here, those archaeological discoveries upended a lot of very accepted theory, and we're now having to make new theories that accommodate stuff like that. And my opinion, and the opinion of other people that are in the field, is that it's not necessarily uniform, this process. It's kind of... we know that all of these things eventually happen and different people go through different processes to arrive at the same goal. That doesn't make a lot of the older academic people very happy because they like this idea that we need one model that applies evenly. But I don't think I mean, we can't find one thing that applies evenly today, right? Other than very basic tenets, like, I don't know. I was going to say like everybody likes eating, but we can't even say that. So it's hard to come up with one rule that applies to all of humanity. Respect your authority. Exactly. Why do we have to respect your authority? Because God said so. Same chief could be old or inexperienced. Make up some spiritual rituals and merge them with medical knowledge and be charismatic enough to gain authority. No. That's exactly what can happen. Now, it's also fair to point out that we had, and this isn't the history of religion, right? We could actually do an entire other stream on the history of religion. But just like politics and government existed prior to us having full-time people doing politics and government, religion existed before we had centralized religion, right? We had magic and folklore and myth and shamanistic practices galore, right? And we had people that knew more about that stuff than others, and that was okay to exist, and it's fine. It doesn't wreck any of the discussion that we're having. It's just that this moment of surplus allows this to come to the forefront very quickly because we, in our imagination time, start asking questions like, why are we here? What's the purpose of all of this stuff? And it's very easy for a person who has centralized political power to apply that through religious means, or a person who has acquired religious power to adopt political stances to accomplish the same goals, right? Again, the basic idea, religion and politics always overlap. And they're always going to. And as much as a lot of people in the Western world want to think about it, they still do. And if you are completely unaware of how religion and politics overlap, I don't know how much political stuff you're reading. They still very much overlap. And they still very much have an impact on each other, right? Will someone rid me of this meddlesome priest? Exactly. Can the old guy who knows when to travel from place to place specialize in priesthood before the settling? So, Frank, that's a great question. And again, it gets back to this idea that we can have specialization prior to sedentary life. If we can just have a limited surplus that's not enough to allow us to stay in one place, but allow us to move around semi-regularly or a little bit, we can have specialization in religion, even if that person is a religious first among equals, right? So we have this political concept of first among equals, and that person might get to speak first at the tribal gathering, or that person might get to pick where they build their hut if we're moving to a new spot, so they get kind of prime location. But we can have religious first among equals as well. We've been largely ignoring religion because it's not necessarily completely germane to the discussion prior to right now, but right now it's 100% germane. Separation of church and state is a relatively recent concept. Double triple, it absolutely is. We really don't see the beginnings of that happening until the 1500s, and that really, really doesn't get into kind of the swing of things until we get into the 1700s. And we don't, but even in the 1700s, we do still see a lot of people arguing for like the divine right of kings, right? So if Louis XIV, the Sun King, one of the greatest, most powerful kings of all France, was all about some religious unity with political position, right? So he was he was king because God said so. I joked, or I slipped there and said that he thought that he was God. That's not necessarily too far from the truth. It's not accurate, but Matt, I appreciate the joke there. But the concept is that this is not far from one another, and historically speaking, they've never been very far from one another. But with a chief, we're going to get further impacts on our concept of government and politics. If we have somebody that's specializing in government, if we have a person that's exercising government power, they're going to have politics. And politics back then isn't party politics necessarily. It's more like making sure that everybody does what I want them to. These early chiefs are not despots. They're not unilaterally super powerful. They still rely on other people making the surplus for them so that they can survive. The the feedback between population and chief is going to be much easier to do because we're still dealing with relatively small populations. So we're still into the thousands, which by itself is revolutionary for the time contemporaneously. But in today's world, it would be sort of silly for us to understand that the president have a one-on-one interaction with most people in the country over the course of 4 years. We have 330 something million people that live in the United States. It's just not a way to do that. But if we have, let's say 2,000 people living in our chiefdom, and we've got, a centralized location where our chief is going to live, the chances of us running into this person over the course of our life is fairly high, right? And that person even knowing your name or knowing something about you or remembering something about you is fairly high. And with that level of familiarity, you're not going to be unassailable as a leader, right? You don't have unilateral authority. Even if you concentrate, as Frank mentioned, like the good fighters behind you, you still don't have unlimited power because they can kill you. And how many times do we hear stories of like the bodyguard killing the king or the bodyguard killing the emperor, right? We see this stuff happen really frequently. It's not a guarantee that you get the position and hold on to the position in perpetuity, right? Like Napoleon. Yeah, exactly. My vocabulary is humbling. I just read a lot of books and I say lots of fancy words. As an anthropologist, I see our vocabulary, especially our effective vocabulary, shrinking. And as a person who is fascinated with linguistics, this hurts my feelings, right? It hurts my feelings. The capacity for language is one of the most important skills that we have as a species, and we are losing our ability to communicate. I actually just read an article earlier today about people losing the ability to write with a pencil or a pen, and us losing vocabulary. You would think that with the internet and our access to unlimited amounts of information, that our vocabularies would be growing, but it's actually going in the opposite direction. For the last about 5 or 6 years, data shows our vocabulary shrinking, and the number of words that people are using and the number of words that people recognize shrinking. And it's kind of alarming for me. How scared are you of the idiocracy future? Not as scared as a lot of people. I don't necessarily think that is a complete likelihood. I think that one of the biggest gaps between where we are now and idiocracy is that intelligent people now are complacent. And because of our general complacency, we allow a lot of stuff to happen. But I think if we were actually going to ever get towards idiocracy, we would have a concerted effort by people that understand things to keep that from happening, right? I am worried about the future of our ability to communicate, sure. And I see that happening even in my classes because I'm going to have to limit the way that I teach because students literally can't understand the words that I'm using in class. I think I mentioned this on a stream earlier. I don't know if this was like a proper stream or if it's if it was maybe a model building stream. But I had to explain the word rebate to one of my classes last semester. Because they didn't know what the word rebate meant. So there we go. Have I ever read Tolkien? You should check him out. He was somewhat of an amateur linguist. He kind of did it for a living, right? Cave Geek is joking. For those of you that haven't been around for very long or don't know me personally or don't know me very well, I'm a gigantic Tolkien fan. So much so that I can update you that we are 6 followers away from having a History of Middle-earth stream. So if you know your friends or if you've been hanging around and you want to help us get to a History of Middle-earth stream, we are 6 followers away from 1,300. And when I hit 1,300, I will do History of Middle-earth. We will be in the Second Age, and I'm actually going through the history of Middle-earth as if it were an actual history lesson. I've got a 12 or 13 part series already. The easiest way to watch those is on YouTube. There's a History of Middle-earth playlist that you can watch. Junk Collector, good to see you. Rome, is that you? Me too, but with different books. That's fair. You're not missing the understanding with context. You always just hear words that you never heard before. Well, Ron, I appreciate that, and you didn't upset me at all. I just wanted to, if anything, the lack of terminology that people use today is what's upsetting. The kids will invent more words. Yes, indeed. So Flask, there's a movie that came out back early 2000s called Idiocracy. And the premise of the movie is that an average guy from our time gets locked into a cryogenic chamber and wakes up something like 200 years in the future. And even though he's just an average guy from our time, he ends up being the smartest person in the country 200 years in the future. And that the country just in general had been taken over by idiots. And he ends up saving the world because he has basic knowledge. Like, you shouldn't spray sports drinks on crops. You should spray water on crops. And that's the joke with electrolytes. Shane's not a fan. He's a Tolkien scholar. I will claim that. Yes, I'm explaining the Silmarillion, Dame Karen. I've actually finished explaining the Silmarillion itself. Well, okay, so the book, oh my gosh. Yes. Watch the episodes, you'll understand more. I can't get off on that tangent right now because I'll be deep in the world. Have I read the Silmarillion? And of course, the next question would be, did you actually follow it? Yes, I've read the Silmarillion multiple times. I have large chunks of it memorized, and I know the difference between Fingon, Fingolfin, and Finrod. So I'm a giant nerd when it comes to Tolkien stuff. But it's what plants crave. I know. So if you watch the series, I break it down really, really easy and show pictures and talk through stuff. You'll be able to understand it. I promise you. I go into the description of what happened with the understanding that people maybe have never read the Silmarillion before. And even if you have no background in Tolkien at all, you'll be able to pick up on it. And if you ever have questions, you're always welcome to shoot me a message on Discord. You sat down once with the intention of actually following the Silmarillion and ended up with a notebook full of scribbling. It's fair. It's hard to follow. All right. I guess it's fair to say, and this is fairly clear by the fact that I haven't talked about any of it in just a little bit. We have kind of gotten to the end of the point of the stream tonight. So we came up with specialization, we developed a food surplus, and then we settled down. And all of these things have massive impacts on how we think about government and politics. And in many ways, we are setting the roots of what we might start seeing as more relatable government and politics, right? So that is the end of that. Now, if anybody has any questions about this, or I guess any questions about anything else, you're welcome to ask. But that is sort of the wrap up of episode 3 here. Shade's a professional educator and is actually good at it. Well, thank you, Junk Collector. I appreciate that. It's hard because they refer to a lot of places in the same way they refer to a lot of people. Dane Karen, I use the map of Middle Earth extensively and point at locations and remind people of where things are. So I take that into account. Yeah, I'm a giant fan of Tolkien. There's a whole shelf and a half, almost 2 shelves of books, like right off camera right here, that are all Tolkien books of various sorts. I really like Tolkien stuff. I think Tolkien once said drawing the map was the first thing he did when writing Lord of the Rings. One of his sayings, and this might be where that kind of comes from, is start with a map. Because if you don't, you'll always try to go back to it and you'll mess it up. So he said that if you're going to write a big fantasy, you draw the map first, and you start with the map, and you tell the story from there, because you can't make it in reverse. But of course, the map that's in the book isn't even one that he finished himself. His family had to finish most of it for him because he was so slow in doing things. But I talk about that too. So let's say map, yeah. You said earlier something like, we learned the hard way that we can't share all technology with all people. Correct. Are there examples where sharing too much of the technological concept leads to ruin? Yeah, Rexler, that's a great question. Imagine today if every government and every political, ideological group on Earth had a nuclear weapon. Right? So every terrorist group had a nuclear weapon, every country had a nuclear weapon, and like every ethnic identity group had a nuclear weapon. How fast would we start slinging those at each other? Yeah, that wouldn't be good. Yeah, right. So there's a point where we recognize that some technology is dangerous and some information is dangerous. And this gets into politics a lot, right? Because then we have to figure out who gets what and whether or not this group is justified with that, and who makes the decision about who gets what technology and who doesn't get what technology. It's always it's a question of control. And I mean, government and politics are systems of control. I mean, they're very basically systems of control. So is religion, for that matter, right? We're controlling our base urges by telling groups that there are non-human based morality standards that we have to live up to. And every religion tells us that we don't do things by urge the right way, right? So we have to limit our urges. So it's all just about control. And I'm not trying to say that like I'm a conspiracy seer saying, it's all about control. It just really is. There's nothing negative about that on its face. Obviously, that can be used in the negative because human beings are human beings and we're capable of great, horrible things. We're also capable of really amazing things, right? We just don't always do the thing that we should. You're scared enough with the people that do, right? Exactly. That's a bit contrived, though, because a nuclear weapon is a highly impractical device needing constant explosive maintenance. Well, sure, it's... okay, I mean, how about something like if we live in a village of, 100 people, does every single person in that village need to know? Okay, so you're chief of the village, right? Someone comes to you and says, hey, I'm having trouble with my significant other, and we're getting into fights, and my significant other is hitting me, right? If I'm the chief, I can step in and tell the significant other, stop hitting the person, right? And if they stop, does everybody in the tribe need to know that? If I am capable of solving the problem as the leader, and I was able to completely eliminate the issue by exercising my authority, is that knowledge that every single member of the 200-something population village need to know? And there are arguments for yes and no, but most political arguments are going to be like, no, if you solve the problem, not everybody needs to know it was even a problem, right? If I'm the chief, and we're practicing collective farming, and I know that the surplus this year was small, and that I was going to have to ration food distribution for next year, and that the rations might even get to the point where people would be at starvation. Do I tell them that on the first day of spring, or do I play that out to the point where we've understood that it's going to be a reality, and now we've come to terms with it more? There are a million scenarios that I could give you where monopolization of knowledge and technology are problems. Like let's say one person in our group figures out how to make a metal knife, and we are a group that has access to metal, and everybody else is running around with stone knives, and we've got this one person with a metal knife. If I'm the chief, I want the metal knife, right? And I want that person to only make metal knives for me, because I want to be in control of that technology, because if everybody else is running around with metal knives, I'm not going to have the competitive edge anymore. And I can use that as a way to propel myself politically and governmentally by controlling access to this particular luxury item that has practical effects in the real world, right? If I'm going to go into battle, I'm going to have the best armor, the best weaponry, period, because I'm the king, or I'm the chief, right? We're not to kingdoms yet. So politics are going to figure out ways to limit spread of information and technology. Are there famous historical instances of that, like some society that shared too much info around the Bronze Age? The end of the Bronze Age is notable because the Hittite kingdom, or the Hittite Empire, had developed iron technology. They were the only people in the Bronze Age that figured out how to do iron stuff. And because of that, they were terrifying. The Hittites beat up everybody for a while. That is until everybody kind of ganged up on them and wiped them out for it, right? But as long as they had the competitive edge and they were the only people that could do it, and everybody else was sort of content with them having that edge but not using it against other people, they were kind of cool with it. But then when the Hittites started expanding and it made everybody else uncomfortable, then everybody else, showed up, and it was the end of the Bronze Age. So all right, I think that's a good place to kind of stop here. Let us go ahead and do a raid, and we're going to go over here and raid a new streamer that I'm not following. I'm going to have to search and filter. Well, Don, thank you so much for raiding in. I appreciate it. So we're going to go raid Baraday, I guess is how we say this. So this is a person who is getting a PhD candidate. I'm guessing in philosophy, but apparently also talks about stuff like social science, etc., stuff like this. Do I know how many episodes are going to be in this series? I don't, Rexler. We're going to kind of go until I'm done. Maybe. Oh, he's a continental. Okay, that's fine. Right. That's okay. Totally okay. As long as he's not a postmodernist, we'll be fine. All right, so we're going to go raid Baraday. Thanks for everybody coming out. I appreciate all the back and forth. This has been a much more active conversation than I thought that it would be. I knew that there were going to be people that were interested, but man, Nick Slottle, you came in and said hello, and I didn't even say hello to you. I'm so sorry, Nick Slottle. hello, but also goodbye. I apologize for not saying hi. I saw you, but then like I said hello in my head, and I didn't say it out of my mouth. I don't know if that makes any sense to you as a fellow streamer, but that's kind of what happened. Anyway, so thanks to everybody for hanging out in the chat. Thanks to people supporting the channel. Grethar, thank you for the subscription. And Don, thank you so much for the raid. Let me also say thanks to people that support me off stream. You could see people here that are patrons of mine on Patreon and people that have sent me books for the giant stack of books. So let's go raid Bear Day, and we'll yell adventure when we get there. And if you put lots of exclamation points behind it, that would be cool too. But until next time, everybody, take it easy.